The wind had teeth, and it was chewing on the bones of the world. It screamed over the high plains, a pale and hungry ghost, piling snow into drifts that buried fences and erased roads. Under the bruised purple of a late afternoon sky, in a shallow ditch that offered no real shelter at all, a small shape lay curled against the frozen earth. It was a child, barely visible, a knot of threadbare brown wool against the impossible white. Her face, peeking from the thin wrap, was the color of old porcelain, cracked with cold. In her arms, she clutched a bundle wrapped in sacking, holding it to her chest with a fierce, final sort of strength. This was a place for endings. The land itself was an ending, a vast frozen chapter of stone and ice. And for the child, the end was very near now. Her breath was a faint vapor, a whisper of life soon to be silenced by the howl of the wind. A story was closing. But in the bitter quiet of that wilderness, another story, one long thought finished, was about to begin again. Silas saw it from the ridgeline. He wasn't looking for it. He was looking for nothing, as he did most days. He was a man who had made an art of looking for nothing and finding it everywhere. He'd been checking a section of fence line he knew was already down, a pointless chore that served only to pass the hours between the rising and the setting of a sun he no longer cared to see. His horse, a gray gelding as weary as its master, shifted under him, sensing the change in the air, the sudden tension in the man's grip on the reins. At first, he thought it was a coyote, or a dead deer half buried by the storm. He almost rode on. It was not his business. Nothing was his business anymore. The world and its sorrows could bleed out into the snow for all he cared. He had already watched his own world do just that. But something held him. A flicker of movement? A trick of the failing light? He nudged the gelding forward, down the gentle slope, the crunch of hooves on crusted snow, the only sound besides the ceaseless wind. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. Not an animal. A person. A small one. He felt a familiar, unwelcome tightening in his chest, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. He pulled the horse to a halt a dozen yards away and dismounted, his movement stiff. The cold hit him like a fist. Every step was a labor. He walked toward the ditch, his rifle held loosely in one hand, a habit from a life he tried to bury. It was a girl, 5 years old, maybe 6. Her hair was the color of straw, matted with ice. Her lips were blue. She was so still, so utterly still, that he was certain she was already gone. He felt a hollow relief at the thought. Death was a clean thing. It was the living that were messy. But then her eyelids fluttered. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement. No, 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 no. He knelt beside her, the cold seeping through the thick wool of his trousers. He reached out a gloved hand, hesitated, then touched her cheek. It was like touching stone. He saw the bundle in her arms then, clutched with a strength that seemed impossible for such a frail creature. A baby, he thought, with a fresh wave of horror. A newborn wrapped in rags. His own past rose up to choke him. The memory of a small, cold grave on a hill behind his cabin. The weight of a tiny, lifeless body in his arms. He recoiled, stumbling back a step. He couldn't do this. He wouldn't. He had made a pact with the silence, with the emptiness. This girl, this new and terrible sorrow, had no place in it. He should turn around, get back on his horse, and ride away. He should let the snow do its work. It was a kinder death than many, but he couldn't move. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, were open now, fixed on him. They were not pleading. They were not afraid. They were just empty, devoid of everything but a weariness that belonged in the eyes of an old, old woman. Her lips parted, a crack in the frozen mask of her face. A sound, barely a breath, escaped. "You're too late," she whispered. The words struck him harder than the wind. They were not an accusation. They were a statement of fact. "You're too late. She's gone. Hope is gone. Everything is gone." And in that moment, the ice that had encased Silas's heart for 5 long years began to crack. He looked at this tiny, dying child who had already accepted her fate, and for the first time since he had buried his wife and daughter, he felt something other than the dull ache of his own grief. He felt a terrible, searing rage. Before we go any further, before we follow this man and the choice he is about to make, I want to take just a moment to thank you for being here. Stories like this one are only possible because of people like you who are willing to listen. If you find yourself wanting to know what happens next, the best way to make sure you don't miss it is to subscribe to the channel. And I'd love to know where you're watching from. Go ahead and leave a comment below telling me what city or country you're in. It's a powerful thing to see how a single story can connect people from all across the world. Thank you for that. Now let's return to that windswept ditch and the man who had just been told he was too late. Silas looked from the girl's ancient eyes to the bundle she held. He reached for it. Her grip tightened, a last flicker of defiance. "Easy now," he said, his voice a rough, unused thing. "Easy." He gently worked her frozen fingers loose. The bundle was stiff and lighter than he expected. He pulled back the sacking. It was not a baby. It was a leather satchel, heavy and stiff with the cold. A ledger of some kind, its corners worn and its cover dark with age. The girl's eyes never left his face as he looked at it, then back at her. Her duty done, her small body finally surrendered. Her eyes rolled back and she went limp. He acted without thinking. The part of him that was once a husband, a father, a man who cared, took over. He swept her up into his arms. She weighed nothing, a bird, a shadow. He wrapped his own heavy coat around her, pulling her tight against his chest, trying to force his own warmth into her frozen limbs. He carried her to the horse, mounted with a grunt of effort, and settled her in front of him. He turned the gelding for home, urging it into a trot that was as fast as he dared. The wind howled at his back, trying to reclaim what it had almost taken. He buried his face against the child's icy hair and whispered into the storm. "Not yet," he said. "Not this one." The journey back to the cabin was a blur of gray and white. The world had shrunk to the space he occupied, the small, desperate circle of warmth he was trying to create around the child. He could feel the terrible cold of her body even through the layers of wool and leather. It was a dead cold, a cold that reminded him of things he spent every waking hour trying to forget. He remembered laying out his wife, Mary, on their bed, her skin already cooling, the life gone from her eyes. He remembered holding his daughter, Lily, who had been so full of warmth and laughter, and feeling that same inexorable chill creep into her small hands. He shook his head, trying to dislodge the memories. This was different. This child was still breathing. He could feel the faint, shallow rise and fall of her chest against his own. It was a fragile pulse, a guttering candle flame in a hurricane. But it was there, and he found himself clinging to it as fiercely as she had clung to that leather satchel. His cabin was small, rough-hewn, and isolated, hunkered down in a copse of pines that offered some small protection from the wind. It was more of a fortress than a home, a place he had built to keep the world out. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a sign that the fire he'd banked that morning was still alive. He slid from the horse, the child still cradled in his arms, and kicked the door open. Warmth washed over them, thick with the smell of wood smoke and stale whiskey. He carried her straight to the hearth, where a bed of red coals glowed. He laid her gently on the bearskin rug he kept there, her tiny form looking lost and broken in the dim, flickering light. He dropped the satchel on the floor beside her. He didn't care about it. Not now. For a long moment, he just stood there, looking down at her. He was a man adrift, his routine shattered. He hadn't had another living soul in this cabin in 5 years. The silence had been his only companion. Now it was broken by the child's shallow, ragged breaths. He felt a surge of panic. He didn't know what to do. He was a man who knew how to mend fences, break horses, and track game. He had forgotten how to mend a person. Then instinct, buried under years of grief and solitude, kicked in. Warmth. She needed warmth. He stoked the fire, adding logs until it roared to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Then he turned back to the girl. Her clothes were thin and soaked through, frozen stiff in places. They were stealing what little heat her body had left. His hands, clumsy and calloused, fumbled with the buttons on her thin coat. He worked as gently as he could, peeling away the damp, cold layers. Underneath, she was a creature of sharp angles and pale skin, her ribs stark beneath a smudged cotton shift. There were bruises on her arms, dark and ugly in the shape of fingers. A fresh wave of rage, cold and clean, cut through his panic. Someone had hurt this child. He found a collection of old wool blankets in a chest at the foot of his bed, blankets that hadn't been used since Mary was alive. They still held a faint scent of lavender and cedar. He wrapped the girl in them, swaddling her like an infant, leaving only her small, pale face exposed. He propped her head up with a pillow. Next, water. And broth, if he had any. He moved to the small kitchen area, his movements becoming more certain, more purposeful. He found a tin of beef broth and a half loaf of stale bread. He put a pot of water on the stove to heat, his mind working through the next steps. Fever. Wounds. He was a stranger in his own home, seeing it through new eyes. It was a place of stark, male loneliness. A bottle of whiskey sat on the table, half empty. A plate from the night before was still crusted with food. The floor was dusty. It was no place for a child. He looked back at her, a tiny mound of blankets by the fire. He saw not a stranger, but a ghost. The ghost of his own daughter, Lily. She had been 6 when the fever took her, just a little older than this girl. She'd had the same straw-colored hair. He remembered sitting by her bed, helpless, holding her hand as the warmth fled from it. The memory was a physical blow, and he leaned against the counter, his eyes closed, his breath catching in his throat. He had failed his own child. He had failed his wife, who had died of a broken heart a year later. He had failed everyone he had ever loved. And now the world had brought him another failure, another dying child to watch over. It was a cruel joke, a punishment. He pushed the thoughts away. Self-pity was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not now. He ladled some of the warm broth into a cup. He knelt beside the girl again. He dipped his fingers in the broth and moistened her cracked lips. Her eyelids flickered. He tried to trickle a few drops into her mouth. Most of it ran down her chin, but he thought he saw her swallow once. It was enough. He sat there for a long time, watching her. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the moan of the wind outside. He watched the slow, almost imperceptible return of color to her cheeks, from a deathly white blue to a pale, translucent pink. He watched her breathing deepen, losing some of its ragged edge. He was tending a fragile flame, and the world was a storm waiting to blow it out. He felt a strange, fierce sense of possession. This was his fire to tend, his storm to fight. The thought was terrifying, and for the first time in a very long time, it made him feel alive. Hours passed. The sky outside the single window turned from purple to a deep, starless black. The storm raged on, a wild animal clawing at the walls of the cabin. Inside, a fragile peace had settled. Silas sat in his worn armchair, the rifle across his lap, watching the child sleep. He hadn't moved, hadn't eaten, hadn't touched the whiskey bottle. He was a sentinel, a guardian, a role he thought he had abandoned forever. Sometime near midnight, she stirred. A small whimper escaped her lips. Her eyes opened. They were wide with confusion, then terror. She tried to scramble backward, away from him, a frantic animal movement, tangling herself in the blankets. Her eyes darted around the unfamiliar room, searching for an escape, finally landing on him, the large bearded stranger sitting in the shadows. He didn't move. He kept his hand still, resting on the rifle in his lap. He knew what he looked like, a big, rough man, a threat. He remembered gentling a spooked filly once, how he'd had to make himself smaller, quieter, to earn her trust. He set the rifle carefully on the floor beside his chair. He leaned forward, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm. "You're safe here." The words seemed to have no effect. She was coiled like a spring, ready to bolt. Her gaze was fixed on him, her small body trembling. Fear was radiating from her in waves. It was a fear of him, he realized, not of the storm or the cold. It was the fear of a creature that has only ever known cruelty from the hands of men. He thought about what to do. Words were useless. He needed to show her. He stood up slowly, and her flinch was so violent he froze. He held his hands up, palms open, a gesture of peace. "I'm just getting you something to eat," he said softly. "You must be powerful, hungry." He backed away toward the stove, never turning his back on her completely. He took the pot of broth, which he had kept warm, and poured some into a bowl. He broke off a piece of the stale bread and put it on a plate beside the bowl. It wasn't much. It was, in fact, the last of his food until he could get to town, which might not be for days if the snow kept up. He hadn't even thought about that until now. It didn't matter. He brought the food over, not to her, but to the hearth. He set the bowl and the plate down on the stones, a good 6 feet from where she was huddled. Then he retreated to his chair, making himself small again, watching. She didn't move for a long time. Her eyes flickered from his face to the steaming bowl and back again. The smell of the warm broth filled the small cabin. It was a smell of life, of comfort. For a child who had known only starvation, it must have been a powerful lure. He could see the struggle in her face, the war between her desperate hunger and her deep-seated fear. Slowly, cautiously, she began to move. She crawled out of the cocoon of blankets, moving like a fawn, ready to leap away at the slightest sound. She crept toward the bowl, her eyes never leaving him. She reached the hearth, snatched the piece of bread, and scurried back to the safety of her blankets. She ate it like a starving animal, tearing at it with her teeth, not chewing, just swallowing. The sound was heartbreaking. When the bread was gone, she looked at the bowl of broth. The fear was still there, but the hunger was winning. She crawled back to the hearth, and this time, she stayed there. She picked up the bowl with trembling hands and drank, her small throat working convulsively. She drank it all, tipping the bowl up to get the last drop. When it was empty, she set it down. A single shuddering sob escaped her, then another, and another. The fear and hunger and pain she had been holding inside for so long finally broke free. She curled into a ball on the bearskin rug and wept, her small body shaking with the force of her grief. Silas didn't move. He just sat there and let her cry. He knew there was no comfort he could offer that she would accept. He was the stranger, the monster in the shadows. All he could do was bear witness to her sorrow. And in her broken sobs, he heard the echoes of his own, the sound of a world torn apart, the sound of a heart breaking. He sat in the firelight, a silent, grieving giant, as the lost child cried for everything she had lost. The storm of her weeping eventually subsided, leaving behind a profound quiet. She lay exhausted on the rug, her breathing evening out into the rhythm of sleep. Silas felt a shift inside him. The wall he had built around his heart, stone by painstaking stone, was crumbling. This small broken creature had found a crack and slipped through. He felt a fierce, terrifying wave of protectiveness wash over him. It was an emotion he hadn't felt in 5 years. It hurt. It hurt like a frozen limb thawing out, a pins and needles agony that was almost unbearable. But it was better than the numbness. Anything was better than the numbness. He must have drifted off because he was startled awake by a small sound. He opened his eyes. The fire had burned down to embers, and the gray light of dawn was filtering through the window. The girl was awake. She was sitting up, watching him. The fear was still in her eyes, but it was muted now, replaced by a cautious curiosity. He sat up straighter in his chair. "Mornin'," he said, his voice thick with sleep. She didn't answer. She just watched him. She had pulled one of the blankets around her shoulders like a shawl. "You got a name, little one?" he asked gently. She hesitated, her eyes dropping to her hands, which were twisting a loose thread on the blanket. She whispered something, so quiet he couldn't hear it over the dying wind outside. "I'm sorry," he said, leaning forward. "I didn't catch that." She looked up at him, her gaze direct and unnervingly clear. "Ilara," she said, her voice small but firm. "Ilara," he repeated. It was a pretty name, a name that sounded like stars. "That's a fine name. My name is Silas." She absorbed this information without comment, an old soul in a child's body. He could see the questions in her eyes, but she didn't ask them. "Ilara," he began, trying to choose his words carefully. "Can you tell me what happened? How you came to be out there?" Her face went blank, a shudder coming down. She shook her head, a small, sharp movement. She hugged the blanket tighter around herself. "All right," he said quickly, holding up a hand. "All right. You don't have to." He knew better than to push. He had to let her come to him. He got up and rekindled the fire, then set about making coffee. The familiar morning ritual calmed him. He found some oats in the back of the pantry and cooked a pot of porridge, adding a spoonful of precious brown sugar he'd been saving. He set a bowl for her on the hearth again, in the same spot as the night before. This time she didn't hesitate. She ate slowly, carefully, like a person, not a wild thing. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackles of the fire and the scrape of her spoon against the bowl. When she was finished, she set the bowl down and looked at him. "My ma'am is gone," she said, the words flat and factual. There were no tears. It was as if she had cried them all out already. Silas's heart clenched. "I'm sorry to hear that, Ilara. Very sorry." "She told me to run," the girl continued, her voice a monotone. "She gave me the satchel and told me to run and not look back. She said I had to find the old lawman, the one who lives past Whisper Creek. She said he would know what to do." Silas went very still. There was only one man who lived past Whisper Creek. Him. "Why, Ilara," he asked, his voice barely a whisper, "why did she tell you to find me?" "Because of the man in the black coat," she said. "The man from the Sterling Company. He wanted the book. Ma'am said it was the only thing that could stop him. She said the lawman would understand. She said he owed him." Sterling. The name hit Silas like a physical blow. A ghost from his past, a name he had tried to drink and work and grieve into oblivion. Sterling. The wealthy magnate who owned the mines, the railroad, the whole damn county. The man who bought lawmen and judges like cattle. The man whose negligence had caused the mine collapse that had started the sickness that had taken his Lily. And the man who had ruined him and so many others. And this child was a refugee from his war. He looked at the leather satchel, which he had tossed aside and forgotten. It lay on the floor near the door, innocuous, covered in dust. The book, a ledger, evidence. "The men, they hurt your ma'am?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Ilara nodded, her eyes fixed on some distant, terrible memory. "She tried to fight them, to give me time. The man with a scar on his face, he was angry. He hit her. She fell down and didn't get up. She told me to run. So I ran." The pieces clicked into place, the bruises on her arms, the desperate flight through the storm. The final whispered words, "You're too late." She hadn't been talking about herself. She'd been talking about her mother. Silas felt the hollow ache in his chest fill with something hot and sharp. It was rage, pure and undiluted. The grief he had carried for 5 years like a shroud began to change, to transmute. It was no longer a passive, crushing weight. It was becoming fuel. It was becoming a weapon. He had run from Sterling once. After Lily died, after Mary faded away, he had turned in his badge. He had walked away from the fight, broken and defeated. He had come out here to this remote corner of the world to be left alone, to let the past die. But the past hadn't died. It had followed him. It had shown up on his doorstep in the form of a half-frozen little girl with straw-colored hair and her mother's last desperate hope clutched in her arms. He looked at Ilara, at her small, serious face. He saw her resilience, her impossible strength. She had survived. She had carried out her mother's last wish. She had found him. Her mother had believed in him, the man he used to be, the man he had tried to kill with whiskey and solitude. He stood up and walked to the door. He picked up the satchel. It was heavy in his hands, heavy with the weight of a dead woman's trust and a child's future. He brought it to the table and opened it. Inside was a thick ledger book. The pages were filled with neat columns of figures, names, dates. It was a meticulous record of bribes, of cut corners, of safety violations, of stolen land. It was the secret history of Sterling's empire, a testament to his corruption written in his own company's ink. It was enough to burn him to the ground. Silas closed the book. He looked at Ilara, who was watching him with those old, knowing eyes. She had brought him the weapon, Now she was waiting to see if he would use it. The bitterness that had been his constant companion for 5 years was gone. In its place was a cold, hard clarity. He had been living in a tomb of his own making, haunted by the ghosts of his wife and daughter. He thought his life was over, but he was wrong. His life as a husband and a father was over, but his life as a man, his purpose, had just been handed back to him. It was a terrible, heavy gift. He had failed his own daughter. He could not save her, but he could save this one. He could not bring justice for Mary and Lily, but he could bring it for Alara and her mother. It was not a choice. It was a debt to the dead and to the living. He felt his jaw lock, his hands clench into fists. The man who had knelt in the snow and wished for a clean death was gone. In his place was someone else, someone older, harder, and far more dangerous. The lawman her mother had been looking for. Alara must have seen the change in him. The air in the cabin crackled with a new intensity. She pulled the blanket a little tighter, a flicker of the old fear returning to her eyes. "Are they coming for me?" she whispered. Her voice was so small, so fragile. It was the question that had been hiding behind her silence all along. It was the question that would define everything that came next. It was a child's plea for certainty in a world that had offered her none. Silas looked at her, at this impossible, brave little girl who had walked through hell and was asking if it was over. He walked over to her, and for the first time, he knelt down so he was at her level. He met her gaze, and he made sure she saw the truth in his eyes. "They might come looking," he said, his voice steady and low. "But they will not find you. They will find me." He reached out slowly and put a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, but she didn't pull away. His hand was large and rough, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "I'm going to make you a promise, Alara," he said. "I will not leave you. Nobody is going to hurt you here. Not while I'm alive. I swear it. On my life." For the first time, a flicker of something other than fear or weariness appeared in her eyes. It was a tiny spark of trust, a fragile seed of hope. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. The pact was sealed. He stood up, his body feeling charged with a purpose it had not known in years. His movements were no longer stiff or weary. They were precise, economical. He walked over to the table where the half-empty bottle of whiskey stood like a monument to his wasted years. He picked it up, walked to the door, and poured the remaining contents out into the snow. The amber liquid vanished into the white, leaving no trace. He tossed the empty bottle into the woodpile. That part of his life was over. He turned back into the room. His gaze fell on the rifle he had left by his chair. It was his hunting rifle, reliable and true. But it wasn't the right tool for the job that was coming. He walked to the large wooden chest at the foot of his bed, the one that held Mary's blankets. He lifted the false bottom. There, nestled in oilcloth, lay his old service revolver and a shotgun, its twin barrels cut short. He took them out, the familiar weight of the weapons settling in his hands like old friends. He spent the next hour cleaning them, his movements practiced and sure. The scent of gun oil filled the cabin, replacing the smell of whiskey. Alara watched him, her silence no longer fearful, but companionable. She understood, in the way that children who have seen too much understand, that this was a ritual. This was preparation for a war. When he was done, he loaded both weapons and set them on the mantelpiece, within easy reach. He looked around the cabin. It was no longer a tomb. It was a fortress, and he was its guardian. He looked out the window. The snow had finally stopped. The world was blanketed in a pristine, deceptive white. It looked peaceful, but he knew it wasn't. He knew that somewhere out there, the man with the scar, the man in the black coat, were searching. And they would eventually find their way here. Sterling always got what he wanted. But this time, something was standing in his way. Silas looked back at Alara. She had fallen asleep again on the rug by the fire, her small face relaxed and peaceful for the first time. She looked like a child should look. Innocent. Safe. He felt that protective ache in his chest again. Stronger this time. It was a wondrous, terrible feeling. He pulled his armchair closer to the fire, so he was sitting beside her. He picked up his old rifle, not the shotgun or the revolver, but the long gun, the one meant for distance. He laid it across his lap and sat there, watching her sleep as the pale winter light filled the room. He was a man with a purpose again. He was waiting. He was ready. The past was over. The future was a fight. And for the first time in 5 long years, he was ready to face it. The battle lines were drawn in the snow and in his heart, and he would not retreat again.